and post it up later, get live stream going as we get as we go through the presentation, able to do so. So thanks for your patience, and we'll get started here in about 30 seconds. Yeah, okay. All right, so we'll get started now. So welcome everybody. This is our first live radio workshop at the Hurricane Conference since 2019. And folks probably remember we did 2 virtual conferences in both 2021 and 2022 over Zoom. As I said, we're having issues with the live stream. If we can get it going mid-workshop, we will. But it's being recorded and we can always upload it after the fact. So we'll have that available and we'll let folks know when that is available. So with that, we'll get right into the presentations. And first of all, our first presentation for today is from Victor Echo 1, Mike Bravo Romeo, Bob Robichaud from the Canadian Hurricane Center. Or not, the last few years, Canada has been kind of a bastion of hurricane activity, almost as bad as parts of the Gulf Coast, not quite as bad, of course, but they've had quite a few hits the last few years. And it's kind of spared my area of New England, but not by much. So Bob's going to give a presentation on the Canadian Hurricane Center operations. Obviously, Hurricane Fiona was a record hurricane and storm system because as it made its transition to post-tropical over the Canadian Maritimes. Bob's going to give a walkthrough of that and a little bit of a preview of the upcoming hurricane season. So Bob, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. All right, good morning, everybody. All good to be here after about a year hiatus live. So basically, we're here to talk about hurricanes. So that's what I'm going to do is set the stage and talk a little bit about what these storms are, how they form, how they behave. And then I'll do a quick review of last season before looking ahead at what we might expect for 2023. So I'll try and speed through this a little bit to get us back on time here. So what are these storms? What is a tropical cyclone? Well, a tropical cyclone is a large storm, uniform in characteristics of temperature and humidity. They form over the warmer water of the tropical oceans around the world. And one of the things that we have to have is a closed center of circulation. Obviously, we need a certain wind speed for a storm to be classified as a tropical cyclone, but we also need that closed center of circulation. Sometimes we get an area of disturbed weather where we do meet that threshold for wind. However, we don't have that closed center of circulation. It's only when we get these two things together that we can classify it as a tropical cyclone. Once it's formed, it's maintained by extracting heat from the ocean and then pumping that into the atmosphere. It's like a heat pump that you have at home. It takes heat from one place, which is the ocean, and pumps it into the atmosphere. So again, they form around the tropics and sometimes the subtropical waters all around the world. Tropical cyclone is basically the generic term, and they get different names. Hurricanes in the Atlantic and parts of the Pacific, typhoons in the Western Pacific. So that the name the storm gets, or what they're called, are essentially depends on the ocean basin that we're talking about. But they're all tropical cyclones. So we can have a situation where an area of disturbed weather actually gets organized, the thunderstorms actually get organized, and it begins some rotation, the whole area of disturbed weather, and then also we have a closed center of circulation, and we get a storm. That's the pure tropical cyclone. But sometimes they can form in a slightly different way. So you might hear a subtropical cyclone. That is when we have an existing area of low pressure. So we already have that center of circulation, but that storm starts to acquire tropical characteristics over time, And then what you end up with is what we call a subtropical storm that gets named once the winds reach that special threshold. In terms of the Atlantic, tropical storm threshold is 39 miles per hour. Now, whether it's a subtropical cyclone or a pure tropical cyclone, sometimes the transition can go in reverse. Sometimes we can have that storm actually transform itself, we call it post-tropical storm. So it started as tropical or subtropical, but it changed itself to something that, from a structural point of view, looks more like a winter storm. And there are certain things that we know happen when that occurs. One, the storm accelerates, usually towards the north or northeast. Rain usually shifts to the left-hand side of the track. The strongest winds are usually found on the right-hand side of the track, and one of the things that we'll see as I move on here is that the storm gets bigger. The wind field actually expands as the storm is going from tropical to post-tropical. So then we classify these based on their wind speeds. So assuming we have that center of circulation, once the winds reach 30 miles per hour, that's when it gets classified as a tropical storm and gets a name. If conditions are right for this storm to continue to intensify, then it may move on to become a hurricane. And we have 5 classes or categories of hurricanes, 1 through 5, with 3, 4, and 5 being major hurricanes. Looking at climatology, one of the things we look at fairly often is obviously the water temperature, because that's what drives these particular storms. And we also look at wind shear. So the look at wind shear over the course of the year. That graph actually has is for the year. So the blue So the blue line here is actually wind shear. So you can see during the winter time, wind shear is usually fairly high, but then it starts to drop off in the spring, bottoming out in August, whereas the temperature, the water temperature in the ocean, bottoms out at the end of the winter, but then starts to warm up again in the spring, and peaks usually around the latter part of September. Between those two areas is kind of the sweet spot for when we get a lot of tropical cyclone activity, and the peak of hurricane season is actually right around September 10th, right between those two, the peak of the water temperature and when the shear actually bottoms out from a climatological perspective. So looking at where these things form, usually in the early part of the season, which starts June 1st and extends until the end of August, is usually somewhere where the water is fairly warm. Gulf of Mexico is usually where we start to see our first storms, or just off the southeastern coast of the United States. And then that area gradually expands as we get into July, August, and September, obviously being the peak month of hurricane season. Again, around September 10th is the peak of hurricane season. And then things start to drop off a little bit once we get into October and November. Looking at a quick look of last season, if we look at the predictions, there's lots of agencies who actually predict the level of activity in the Atlantic over the course of the season. These predictions were from NOAA that were issued at the end of May last year. They're calling for 14 to 21 named storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 6 major hurricanes. And you can see what we actually had there, 14 named storms, which is right at the lower end of what the predicted number of storms were. And we'll see why in a second here. So really the two storms last year, the two most impactful storms were Fiona and Ian. Last year, I see Dan just left here, but Dan was at a meeting last week with the World Meteorological Organization, and that's where they voted on retiring the names Fiona and Ian from the list. So we'll never see those names pop up again. Looking at the tracks of last year, obviously, 14 storms is respectable, but it's certainly not as busy as what we've seen from 2021 years where there were storms all over the map on the years, including the record 2020 season. And here's the interesting part is where the season started off in June, early June, had Tropical Storm Alex. Then we had two storms that formed in early July. They didn't last very long, and then that was it for quite an extended period of time. For the rest of July into the entire month of August, there were no storms whatsoever. People started to get it. So, okay, well, where are all the storms? We were predicting up to 20 or 21 named storms, and we only had 3 up to that point, and 3 of the weak ones. But once we got into September, things really started going again, and we had some storms develop with the major ones being Fiona and Ian, a couple of storms in October, and another couple of storms in November as well. Nicole, which was an impactful storm. A quick walk through the season. We had Alex that formed in the first named storm of the year on June 5th. Then we had Bonnie. Bonnie was an interesting case as it became a tropical storm just before making landfall in Nicaragua. But the storm maintained that well-defined center of circulation as it crossed over into the Pacific. Once it crossed over into the Pacific, since it was the same discernible storm in the Atlantic, it kept its name and then eventually it became a hurricane, but a hurricane in the Pacific. Wow. Then we had Colin that formed off South Carolina, again, July 1st. And then the drill. We didn't have much in the way of storm activity from the rest of July right into early part of September. We had a couple more storms form there in the early part of September. Actually, Danielle formed September 1st. Then we had Hurricane Earl. Hurricane Earl developed, and there were a couple of fatalities as a result of lightning with Earl. Then Earl came up again towards Canada and kind of stalled out as a post-tropical storm and resulted in over 8 inches of rain and significant flooding in parts of Newfoundland and Labrador as a result of Earl. So that was an impactful storm again for us. Then Fiona formed. Fiona formed on September 14th and ultimately became the first major hurricane of the 2022 season on September 9th. It was a large and intense storm when it made a number of landfalls in the Caribbean, but then it eventually transformed itself, what I was talking about earlier, to what we call a tropical storm. And it went straight from a major hurricane to almost a major hurricane strength post-tropical storm, which is fairly unusual. Usually there's a little dip in the intensity. Sometimes it re-intensifies as a post-tropical storm, but with Fiona, we were starting at a really, really strong storm to begin with. There was that little dip, but then it re-intensified, and it made landfall in Nova Scotia on September 24th. And we actually set a new Canadian record for low pressure for any storm ever recorded in Canada. The previous record was around 945 millibars back in the winter. January in 1977. This pretty much shattered for low pressure for any kind of storm in Canada.
Bob, can I ask a question?
Yep.
Why? So it ended up making landfall in Nova Scotia as a post-tropical storm?
Yep.
But I mean, I'm from Nova Scotia, and you don't know what we went through. This was for us. We're still trying to recover from it in many communities. What made it go to tropical storm status when
account the entire cone as to where this storm may go. But there was a lot of focus on that Tampa area when the landfall location was always in the picture. So that was a case where there was a lot of communication on where the storm was going to go, given the angle of approach and given the right hand side of the shift, or the right hand shift in the track. For us, for a couple of days before the storm made landfall, it was coming straight up, and even a little deviation in the track would have still meant that the storm was going to make landfall where it did. But in the end, over 150 fatalities and over $112 billion in damage with Ian. Then we had Julia. Julia was an October storm, fairly significant impacts with 40 or 30 fatalities there. Then we had Carl, another October storm, and then Lisa. Lisa was a late season storm. Again, no casualties, but over $100 million in damage there. Then interesting was Martin. Martin was a late season storm, stayed over the Atlantic, never really affected it. But if we look at what happened to Martin, it peaked out of Category 1, but then it started to make that transition to post-tropical again. And I mentioned these storms grow in size. Look at the size of this particular storm, the wind field associated with this. Some of the models, because we don't have any stations out there in that part of the Atlantic, but if we look at some of the modeling and the analysis for pressure, that bottomed out at 929 millibars as a post-tropical storm. So for folks like me and Rob and Jim in the northern latitudes, this is like almost another Sandy, another 1938 storm, but it was out in the middle of the Atlantic. So in the same year, Fiona, and we had this thing that was out there, and circle the wind circulation here, and you can see the circulation compared to New England and Atlantic Canada. The storm was massive. Again, it didn't really affect too many people, so it largely went unnoticed. And then finally, to finish off the season, we had Nicole, very impactful November storm. It was a Category 1 hurricane, made several landfalls. Most of the issues here were as a result of coastal flooding and erosion. There were 6 fatalities and over $1 billion November storm. We actually had some storm surge way up in Atlantic Canada as well with Nicole. So just looking at the season overall, 303 fatalities, over $120 billion in damage, which makes it one of the costlier hurricane seasons on record, despite having that gap of no storms from early July right up until the end of August. So last year we broke our streak. We were on a streak of a number of years where we had storms that developed hurricane season, and so that streak was broken last year. So about that drought, it was the first time since 1997 that there were no tropical cyclones that formed in the Atlantic in August, and only the 5th time overall, and the first time that this has developed, that this has happened in a La Nina year, where all the other cases were during a El Nino or La Nina year. So now moving on, looking forward as to what we might expect for this hurricane season. What we look at to determine the activity levels in the Atlantic over the course of a season is the same every year. So we look at water temperature, we look at wind shear, we look at things like the Atlantic multi-decadal cycle. So let's look at some of this stuff. This is sea surface temperature anomaly as of yesterday. So you can see off the coast of Africa there, just on the eastern side of what we call the main development region. Water temperature there is already warmer than the long-term average. It's also warmer in the Gulf and off the southeast coast of the United States. But what's really important is what are the predictions for the peak of hurricane season, which is August, September, and October. Well, a lot of the models have a very large warm anomaly in the Atlantic once we get to the peak of hurricane season. So that's going to be something that we're going to be watching very closely of how this evolves over the course of the summer. The other thing we look at is whether we are in an El Nino or La Nina. That determines the overall level of wind shear that we're going to in the atmosphere. So one of the first slides that I showed, showed wind shear that decreases in the spring and summer. So we still expect that to happen, but when we're in a La Nina year, which we have been in the last few years, we tend to have lower average wind shear in the Atlantic. And when we have an El Nino, we have more wind shear in the Atlantic. So El Nino, more wind shear, fewer storms on average. So these are what the models are predicting in terms of this. Again, it's August, September, October. Most of the models are looking at, almost none are predicting a La Nina. Everyone is either predicting El Nino or neutral, which is neither El Nino or La Nina. The official prediction for that, again, August, September, October, is basically a 4% chance of seeing a La Nina. We're either going to be in a neutral situation or El Nino, which would tend to lower the number of storms. Last thing we look at is the multi-decadal oscillation, and we're in an active phase right now. We haven't really seen any signs that we're going to an less active phase. We need a few years of lower tropical cyclone activity to say, okay, there's a trend, but we're still in an active trend. So if we look at all these things together, certainly the water temperature would suggest that it would be an active year. However, the wind shear would suggest that it would be less active. And the multi-decadal oscillation would kind of suggest a little bit more activity. But the wind shear is a big one. The is a big factor in determining the overall level of activity. So one of the things with wind shear is that it doesn't stay stable time during hurricane season. It comes and goes. You get periods of high wind shear and then it subsides a little bit. It's that period when it subsides that it creates a window of opportunity for a tropical cyclone to develop, especially if the water is really warm and there haven't been any tropical cyclones to actually start cooling that water. Once that wind shear drops off, boom, you see a hurricane develop, and it could be a fairly intense hurricane as well. So even in a year where we have overall fewer storms, as we always say, it only takes that one storm to really, really cause some damage. If we look at some of the predictions are really just starting to come out now. So there's a group in Europe called the Tropical Storm Risk. They've actually issued a prediction with numbers. This is fairly old. This is back in, this was predicted in December. They were looking primarily at the wind shear and the El Nino. And that's why their numbers here are a little lower than the longer term average. But they are fairly representative, I think, of what's going to come out in some of these other predictions. They actually updates, Tropical Storm Risk actually up numbers third this week. Colorado State University with Dr. Phil Klotzbach, he issues his first forecast of this season next week, April 13th. And NOAA issues their outlook at the end of May. So there's a couple of forecasts that are yet to come. But I think what we're going to see in terms of the rest of these predictions, slightly lower numbers than what we've seen in the predictions from the last couple of years. Taking a look at what the names are going to be this year, the first storm of the year will be Arlene, followed by Brett, Cindy, and so on. So this is the name, the list of names that we're going to use. Probably unlikely, but if we go through these list of names and we need some more names, we have that supplemental list that we instituted a couple of years ago, which never changes. It's always the same list year after year. So this is what we're going to be using if we run out of names. Again, just looking at the conditions is probably it for me. I just, again, want to thank everybody who's in the room today for coming out. The information
Wanted to mention that Rob has done an excellent job for so many years, and not just with his VoIP hurricane net, but also he organizes this whole thing. Sometimes it takes us months to get everything lined up and speakers lined up and PowerPoints created and flight schedules and hotel reservations and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, and Rob has always done an excellent job, so we thank you, Rob. And then, of course, Jim Palmer, KB1KQW, who is our professional videographer and video streamer and our tech support. And that's him back there behind all the monitors. And he is the one that records everything, puts it on YouTube, and does the live streaming as well. And he also is very, very active with the VoIP Hurricane Net. So going back a few years, just before the coronavirus pandemic, we had a very quiet Atlantic. But then, starting 2021, it became the third most active year in history, with 21 storms, 7 became hurricanes, and 4 became major hurricanes. And 6 of those made landfall in the mainland United States and Gulf Coast, and including all the flooding that we had here in the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. And even Hurricane Larry hit Newfoundland with reports of gusts, ham radio reports, by the way, over 100 miles per hour, which I don't remember what kilometers per hour that is, but it's high.
181.
181, there you go, 181. Anyway, and so here in 2021, we went through all the names. And because of that, we got into some of the Greek alphabet names in 2020 especially, but it caused so much confusion because Zeta came before Eta, and then Ida came after Theta. So it's like, which hurricane first and all that, and we were used to, going down the alphabet. So then in 2022, they decided to come up with the regular names, and 2022 had 14 storms, and they became hurricanes, 2 major. And so this is what we ended up in 2022, and you can see, and Bob did an excellent job of showing everything that hit, but big ones for Florida especially was Ian, which destroyed that coast south of Tampa. And we were watching it very carefully, and we had a lot of local Tampa Bay ham radio operators giving us reports, and then we saw everything kind of shifting just a little bit to the south, and just that little shift. And it happened within one day that it started shifting, and then you know what happened then. I mean, it just destroyed the area south of that, and it affected including Naples and all that area, which was a shame. But even though we may not have a very active season, we can have, why is this just starting? We can have hurricanes like this, that, there we go. That hit Mexico Beach and Panama City in the panhandle of Florida as a Category 5.
That's Ian.
This one was Hurricane Michael. Okay? And they had not had hurricanes for, I don't know, close to 20 years. And then this happens. And you can see some of the results there. I mean, it's just, not just this one example, this one house, but you can see where houses were completely wiped away, and mainly by the storm surge. And that's the thing, is you get the combination, not just the wind, you get that storm surge coming in, you have a coastal community, and between the two of them, it can wipe them out. So then we had here in 2021, Louisiana, which had 3 tropical storms hit, and then this major hurricane named Ida. And it had havoc there. And we'll go through that. And this is now the new name of, for the 2023 season. And it's still predicted to be slightly above average. But here again, even if we have a regular season, we get storms like these that are moving slow, and sometimes they're, a little difficult to predict. And this one, of course, was Ian. So we recommend you have a hurricane plan and get your best helper to put up your hurricane shutters. Make sure you have your spam ready, okay? And of course, we learned our lesson, protect your car, and with coronavirus, make sure you have plenty of toilet paper. Let me tell you, there were fights in parking lots in Miami for toilet paper. I'm serious. It got to be like before Hurricane Andrew, people were having fist fights in the parking lot of Home Depot for a sheet of plywood.
Wow.
Because we were not prepared. Which is the only ones with hurricane shutters. Well, I don't know who thought of that, but When Hurricane Andrew hit, you see the Doppler radar, it disappeared. The 4 generators that were up here ended up in the parking lot. Then all these windows flooded. And what happened to here? Well, of course, all the ceilings caved in. So it's like, so anyway, this was our first radio station there. And you can see, there they are there. And we basically took the ham radio from the Amateur Radio Club of the University of Miami, put it in a cardboard box, put it on the forecaster's desk, and threw a wire out the window. And Neil Frank, Dr. Neil Frank, he put out a word. He says, I need a ham over here that can come here quickly because we're losing communications with the Caribbean because they shut down their Met Office and they lose power. This is 1980. And I happened to be the ham across the street. So they said, can you come over here? I said, sure, why not? And I went over there and I thought, it's just for a while. And they told me the amateur radio service called ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Service, told me, we're going to give you an official appointment for 2 years. I said, thank you very much, that's very good. It's been 43 years. So, and then in the middle of all this, after we get some nearby hits, they said, well, we need to make sure that you can travel with your ham radio equipment. Well, this was in the 1980s. This was our Go Kit. And we built it in an aluminum box, and it weighed about 200 pounds. So that box never went anywhere, okay? And then they kept complaining because you know how hams are, we have wires everywhere. Well, then 1992 came, which was a season that had almost no hurricanes until August. Andrew and became a Category 5 hurricane. And I lived through it. It took half the roof off my house. And I don't even live near where the eye hit in Homestead. I live about 20 miles north of that. We had wind gusts up and Homestead, which has Turkey Point nuclear plant, got hammered hard. And I happened to be the architect that was assigned to Turkey Point nuclear plant back then to find out. It's classified information, I can't give you details, but we had a major building completely collapse. And we had to go out there and analyze what happened. And we found out, well, when you have several buildings facing the ocean, and then you have one building where all that wind coming in from Hurricane Andrew, which was over 200 miles per hour, when it went through those buildings and focused on that one building at the end of the line, it became, well, the anemometer blew off at 220 miles per hour. So of course, you get a Butler frame building, all steel, 4 stories high, facing the ocean, several buildings in the way. What happens? It dominoed. All the Butler frames, these steel frames, these beams were almost 4 feet deep. Okay? Weighed thousands of tons, and this whole thing just clack, 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 clack. So then, the government wisely decided the Hurricane Center should be in a hurricane-proof building. So, in the campus, Florida International University, they had this piece of land, and they built a hurricane-proof building that will withstand a Category 5 and even an EF3 tornado. And these are our original hams that were putting up antennas. The backup communication so much, they said, what do you need? I said, well, we need to go on your roof and put up some antennas. Go into any federal building and say, I'm going to go on your roof and put up the antennas and put some wires through. They're going to go, nah. They said, do it. So we went and put up 7 antennas up there for HF, VHF, UHF. We even had direct lines to the West Coast of Florida, back then, it was I mean, and then they gave us, right in the middle there, this 100-foot tower. And from, you can't see it from there all the way down to there. There's what we call a dipole wire antenna. We have two of them, one as a backup. And believe it or not, we talk around the world with it. 600 watts, we have an amplifier, not a 2,000 watt or 1,500 watt, 600 watts. We talk all over the world with that wire antenna. Why do we chose with the wire for our prime antenna? We have 3 backups. Because the wire flexes in the wind. And during Hurricane Wilma and some of the other hurricanes like Irma, it flexed in the wind. Several of the other ones broke. And their satellite dishes, they flew away. And 1995 happened to be the most busiest season, building active season at the same time. So we were multitasking the whole time. And this is the front, there's 2 big bathrooms inside, 20 each bathroom, steel reinforced with concrete inside the building, It's located right off inside Miami. Yeah. And it's good it's in Miami because it's close to the action. We get a lot of things flying by, and we're always praying, hopefully it'll go that way. In Homestead, about 20 miles north of that. So this is our radio station here, and the first radio we used over there was a Yaesu FD101E, which is a tube, had 4 what they call sweep tubes in there, the old-fashioned tubes that glow red, And Yaesu, when we talked to them about this, they've upgraded our station several times, donated. And just to let you know, all of our equipment, everything here, has been donated by those individual companies. We've never had to pay for our equipment because they can see that we're doing public service, and we're all volunteers. And then the Hurricane Center donated the computers. When they retired them from there, I would say, we don't need anything high speed or anything, we just need to be able to do VoIP. The anemometer blew off at 200 APRS and things like that. So of course, you get it, the Hurricane Center does that. But when we asked Yaesu, we met them at, I think it was Dayton Hamfest in Ohio. And we're just talking to them. They asked what radio you're using, and we had an old Yaesu radio. And the rep for the United States says, give me a list. And then we got all of these. All of a sudden, a box showed up with all the new radios. So we appreciate that. Of course, then we had to learn how to use modern radios because they have, these really beautiful color screens, and you have to program them and all this, but we got it working. The other thing we use quite often, and we use maps like this, which are for APRS, and believe it or not, we get information for our APRS that are beaconed from amateur radio operators who have weather stations that beacon up to the mesonet, and we get them on a map. And sometimes those stations, those hams are not on the air repeating the same thing, so we get that information from them. And then one of our main nets that we use is the VoIP, and this is what it looks like on our screen, and you'll see a whole bunch of stations here connected to it, and some of them are repeater systems. VHF, UHF repeaters, people with a handheld, people in a car, and they all come up to this net, and this net then also supports texting. It's a hybrid type of radio, so it's not just a radio going through a repeater that repeats it over the internet, and that you actually can do it from your computer as well. And it is one of the main sources of information from ham radio operators that are in the affected area that may not have big HF equipment with a big beam and all that. So we combine all those modes, and you'll see how we combine them later. to do all of these things. And as you can see here, some of this here, all the texting back and forth, and this is the chat room for the Hurricane WatchNet, and I'll go into that in a little bit. So when we're on HF on 20 meters, on HF basically, and I don't know how many of you are not hams, we take a radio signal on high frequency and we bounce it off the ionosphere. And sometimes it goes 1,000 miles, sometimes it goes 5,000 miles. Where it lands is where the affected radio station is that's coming back to us. And sometimes with their net controls, because the ionosphere varies, we basically communicate through the internet and text each other to coordinate the efforts. These are our operators here, and all volunteers. Right next to the turnpikes, all of these oil pumps, 56, 56 lines, and the pump from 90 degrees, and all of a sudden we go like that. That was the first time, and of course, any of the people inside the Hurricane Center had to come out and look, because they had never witnessed that personally. The other thing is we do relay the hurricane advisories to stations outside, you know, in other countries and all that, over ham radio. Back in, I think it was Hurricane Michelle that hit the Yucatan area, there was a small fishing village with a ham there, and the only source of information that their local AM radio station had at that time was ham radio. So all the information that was relayed through the hurricane net, he relayed to the broadcast station, who then all the people in that small village with their little AM radio were able to listen and prepare for it. And one of them was when the waters from the lake had receded, they had a bay area receded, and people started going out to look at the exposed bottom of the bay. And we immediately set warnings out there not to do that, because when that water comes back, it's not slow. It comes back as a wave and could kill a lot of people. So hurricane advisories over ham radio. And then enhance and promote the accuracy of weather service reports. And we have a program called ONNHC, and we promote weather stations, amateur weather enthusiasts, and they can send reports directly to us, even if they're not ham radio operators. So you can see that this is only some of the sources of information we get into the ham radio station there, and it's not all just radio. And I know that Rob and his team for the VoIP do an excellent job when propagation is down on HF. We can't communicate directly on HF. And they still get weather reports, damage reports, incident reports through digital forms, whether it's over the internet, over social media, and all of that fills in the gaps. And this is on our website, how to contact us. We cannot be everywhere at the same time. We have limited number of radios, limited number of operators, so we can be on some of these modes and frequencies during a hurricane. But then we ask if you are on DMR or D-Star or WinLink or things like that, try to send it to us in some form because we can't go everywhere. Then a little bit about the Hurricane WatchNet. Bob Graves unfortunately could not make it here to do the presentation that he usually does in person, so I'm going to say a few things about them. And from day one, when we started the Hurricane Center, the Hurricane WatchNet was there. You know, they've been formed since 1965, and they were relaying information to the Hurricane Center back in that day via fax. You know, the machine, you put a piece of paper in and mysteriously it prints over there. And until 1980 when we became in person, and then we were able to participate in their net. So they have control stations, you can see all over the place. In fact, there's some even in Canada, and I think there's some up here, and then down in Central America, South America, even in the Caribbean. And the reason they have that is because of propagation. Where the signal lands, you bounce it off the ionosphere, sometimes you can't predict where it's going to land, but they're all listening for those stations. And just some of the things they do, they disseminate the hurricane advisory over the air. They obtain ground truth weather observations, which we call surface reports. They do backup communication links, and that's basically what we did during Hurricane Katrina with Slidell NWS here. And so you can see many of the things that they communicate with. And then prior to the operations, because they use specific frequencies, and luckily, in the last few years, we were able to establish this as a secondary net for when 20 meters goes down and we don't have propagation on 20 meters, they go down to 40 meters, which is good for the nighttime operations. And they do advise the different nets, because there's other nets that work on those frequencies and say, hey, we're working a hurricane, can you give us priority? And they do, and sometimes the cooperation between some of, like the boat watch net, the maritime mobile net, is good because then we get ship reports. And some of these ship reports are very important. And of course, FEMA and the Red Cross. So he explains to stay informed, especially with the maritime mobile net. And then they have an excellent website where they maintain it with all the detailed information, not just of hurricanes when they're active, but they have some of the preparation guides on there as well. The other net we participate very heavily in is the VoIP Hurricane Net. And the VoIP Hurricane Net, you can see it's an Echo-Link net, and they have a note on our IRLP. IRLP is repeaters. A repeater is basically, you know how you use your cell phone? By the way, I'm talking to people who are not hams. A cell phone doesn't go to a cell phone. It goes to a tower, and that tower is like a repeater. Well, in ham radio, we use repeaters that are VHF, UHF type equipment. And they're basically like this, where I can dial in a frequency, and that repeater then is connected to the internet, who is connected to other repeaters, which we call a conference. And sometimes we would be on one frequency, and we would be able to talk at the same time to Hawaii or to England. And sometimes that repeater can have 100 different locations all connected, and then the conference room as well. So just one example for this, we were working in 2004, Hurricane Ivan, when it was making landfall in Grenada, and it was at night. And the frequencies we were using on HF to bounce off the ionosphere loses its reflective power like a mirror. You know, you shine a light into a mirror and it shines it back, but if the mirror gets foggy, then you don't get a very distinct reflection. So what happens is, we lost all communications with the University of Grenada. And we're like, oh my God, they're about to get hit. And they had evacuated, there were people out in cruise ships. And well, there was a ham in St. Lucia who could hear them. And he became our relay, but he couldn't hear us. So he went from HF to Grenada, then he went to this net using his computer, which relayed it all the way back to us. So that relay from a relay, and like we said, we don't care how we get the surface reports, as long as we get them, we have a source that we can verify. And all those reports from Grenada then were able to reach us. And we had the same exact thing happen with Bermuda when we have that Category 4 hurricane that hit up there. And, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. We also sponsor the APRS CWOP, which is the Citizens Weather Observers Program, and we started that many years ago. And basically, the CWOP is ham radio operators that have weather stations that they can beacon on HF or VHF automatically their weather reports, and it shows up on the Mesonet maps. And then we have APRS, which we can directly connect to those weather stations, and you see them there, and get their data from there. And sometimes, like Hurricane Michael, where we had lost a lot of the ham radio operators that lost their antennas and they didn't have power or whatever, some of their weather stations stayed up. And we were able to see the wind, how it was shifting as the eye went across them. So this is what we need, definitely need this. But we warn you, do not go out there and try to do this by yourself, okay? So if you can safely report something, do it, but don't, anyway, don't go out there. So for people who, whether you're a ham radio operator or a weather enthusiast or a citizen in the affected area, you can go online and you can fill out a report form with all the data, whatever you have. It doesn't have to be complete. It'll accept an incomplete report. You know, make sure we can somehow get back to you and say, hey, by the way, was it really, 180 miles per hour? How'd you measure it? If you did this, true story. We had a hurricane that was hit the Mississippi Delta region one time. And there was a tugboat captain. And he kept sending all of these wind reports. And we were like, oh my God, and he's a tugboat captain. Unbelievable. I said, this is incredible. And then he sent us a pressure report. And it was like 918 millibars. And we're like, what? Everything that we have here is like 950, 960 millibars. I say, what instrument are you using? How do you get? He says, I'm estimating it. And how do you estimate pressure? Anyway, so those reports went in the circular file. Now, this is what we use at the station, and basically, the old-fashioned way, sometimes when we get stuff by voice over the radio, then we write it down. But this is nice because we have a checklist that all the hurricane net control stations also use to be able to say, oh, by the way, you forgot to send us your wind direction. That happens very often. We'd get a wind report or a wind gust. It's like, where's it from? Where's the wind going? This is D-Star, and now we don't have D-Star within our station, but we have a net control from D-Stars and D-Rats, which they do digital communications, and they then send us reports like this. Here again, that's a valid surface reports. And then we also use a system called WindLink, and you see there WL2K. WindLink is a combination of HF radio going into the internet. And they can connect the radio to, their laptop, for example, to the radio, and using a modem, transmit it to another receiver that then brings it back and digitizes it. And believe it or not, they can even send us pictures. So here we go. It's a ham who took a picture, who wrote a report, who put it on his radio through his Pactor modem, brought it over the HF radio. It landed somewhere in the United States or wherever. They put it back in the internet, and all of a sudden, on our computer, there it is.
You do it on
Yep, unpack it, I mean, and here again, it's like I tell everybody, it doesn't matter how it got here, how many steps it took, but the main thing is that it did get here. So can ham radio make a difference? Are we too old? Well, back in the day, there was an article that came out in the Miami Herald about ham radio being dinosaurs. And I remember meeting the reporter and I said, okay. I said, next time you're in Bermuda and a hurricane's hitting, go outside and call me from your satellite phone and give me a wind report. He said, well, I can't do that. I can't. I said, that's why we have ham radio. And then he changed his mind about us being dinosaurs. And real briefly, our first hurricane was Hurricane Allen. It did destroy one of the islands there pretty badly. It went right over St. Lucia. You can see what it did to that house there, just turned it completely upside down. And at that time, we were getting multiple hurricane reports from Victor, J69DJ, and he was the only ham on that island, and he was requesting medical assistance. And all of a sudden, on our frequency, came the British hospital ship called the HMS Glasgow. We're only a day's sail away from helping them. We have so many hospital beds, we have helicopters, but we can't land on the island without governmental permission because they just got their independence from Great Britain. And so I relayed that to Victor in St. Lucia. He says, wait 10 minutes. And he got the Prime Minister of St. Lucia on the ham radio to give them permission to land on the island. And the next day they were there. So here again, a simple transmission. We may have we helped save some lives by getting that process to work. And 1992, here again, I lived through this, and it damaged 300,000 homes. The day after, a few days after Hurricane Andrew, we had over 200 hams out there relaying emergency traffic and then connecting the Navy, helicopters, the National Guard and all that, because they were all on different frequencies. So at the EOC, we had several ham stations hooked up which can communicate to those military and governmental frequencies, relaying them back to our local rescue and police and all that. So we became a vital link in the recovery of all that. Season, and you can see the damage it did, and it changed lives forever. And it did mine, even though I was into hurricanes, kind of, but in different ways. And a lot of people suffered through that, and there's a lot of places that never came back. And after that, I told you I did work at Turkey Point Nuclear Plant, and I went through those areas in Homestead, and they were shopping centers that were just flattened. So you can see a Category 5, what that could do. But how important are surface reports? This was 1998 Hurricane George, and you see the path, how it went through here, okay? And somewhere in here, the eye had gotten kind of, at night, had gotten hard to see, hard to predict, and there was this hurricane forecaster, Lixian Avila, who came in the radio room, and he's kind of an excitable person. Right, Dan? He came in here, he says, I want you to talk to a ham in the most eastern point of Cuba. And I go, Lixian, I said, this is not like dialing a phone. We don't know if there is even one that exists out there. So I said, well, I can get on the Cuban Civil Defense frequency, but I don't have permission to do that. And that somehow I called the FCC, and there was a FCC head, and he says, I can't give you permission. You have to get congressional approval. But I can promise you, we won't be monitoring that frequency this evening. I said, oh, fantastic. I got on there, and lo and behold, I got a ham in Punto Este, Cuba. Unbelievable, the coincidence of all that. And he's screaming into this microphone. He says, there's water in my house. I'm standing on my chair. And Lixie says, what is the wind direction? The wind direction. He says, 95 kilometers per hour. He says, no, the wind direction. And the last three words the guy said was, sur, sur, from the south. And Lixie storms out the room. I'm like, what just happened? That night I get home and I'm watching the 11 o'clock news, and Max Mayfield has our report in his hand. And I'm like, oh, but did we do something wrong? He says, well, we just got this ham radio report from Cuba, and we have now modified the forecast track because they had it going to Guantanamo Air Force Base at one time. And because of the wind direction and the location of that ham, somehow that made a change in the track, and it actually followed that track. So, and we have a few more examples of how these surface reports are important. Hurricane Michelle was coming up through the mountains here, and right here in the Isle of Youth, we started getting reports from a young ham who was in the military in Cuba. I'm like, this is a first. All the flooding in the Isle of Youth. And then I asked him, I said, do you have a radar system there? He says, yes, we do. He started giving us the coordinates of the eye as it went past them and over the island. And I said, he's going to be arrested. Well, that's him right there. Okay. They made him a hero. Unbelievable. So he became a regular on the nets and surface reports. Then we had this boat here, this sailboat, which was in Highborn Key in the Bahamas, anchored there. The Bahamas had lowered the hurricane warnings because the bottom of the eye, the south part of the eye, had opened up and it was starting to lose its hurricane appearance. But this sailboat kept giving us wind reports of 100 to 110 miles per hour. And Max Mayfield came in there, he says, I want to talk to that boat. We got him on the air, he got all the data from, the type of weather instruments he did, and he called the Met Office in the Bahamas, and they lifted their hurricane warnings again. And that was the captain of that sailboat there. So surfers report sometimes, you don't know if it'll make a difference, and it does make a difference. Sometimes we even make some of their hurricane summaries there where, they give us some acknowledgement. Anyway, so since we're here, I'm sure you all remember the big one in the Big Easy that killed 1,833 people. Okay, the deadliest hurricane since 1928, which went through Lake Okeechobee. And that one we were on the air 24/7. And it was very emotional, especially when, we were getting some live reports from hams that were in this condition. And it made a difference when we heard their reports and the flooding that happened. And here again, we couldn't visualize the scope of what was happening there. So, we went through all that. And then this is our perspective here inside the Hurricane Center. And it was all hands on deck. And I remember, all of the loud discussions about what was happening and the coordination with the local governments here, and how Max was on the phone and insisting on evacuations early and all this stuff. And then we got this report here where NWS had lost all communications with Charles and with Slidell and some of the other NWS stations. They had nothing left. But then Slidell had a ham operator there, okay? And he was able to contact us after we went through, and we had hundreds of hams looking for them because we had no prearranged frequency for them, got them on our frequency, and they started sending all these reports, okay? 90 knot sustained winds, 120 gusts. I mean, this is right when it was just before getting through Slidell. And those reports did make a difference. And we stayed on the air with them for 6 hours, even after it went through, because they had a staff of like 40-some people there, and they were trapped inside the building because all the trees had fallen and blocked their way out. They couldn't get out. So then we were relaying what we call health and welfare information to their loved ones, saying, yeah, they're okay, whatever. And all these hands from that area were relaying back to them. So that's some of the things they do. And this was a live, if it starts automatically, it's supposed to. Nope. Let me go back. This was a live radio communication. And it worked before. There we go. This was during Hurricane Katrina. Just to give you a sense of what it sounded like.
Hi, sir.
I'll get that.
Okay, overall peak 120 knots. Okay, NHC, yes, that's current millibars 945 and current peak 90 knots. Overall peak 120 knots. Over.
Roger that. Can we have a time for the peak, please?
Okay, very good.
Okay, it's 90 knots now. 945 millibars now, with a peak of 120 knots.
You
Did
have
you get
a
that, Charlie?
recorded time for that 90 knot peak. Over. Okay, very good. 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes ago, Ken. Over.
Roger, the 5 minutes ago. Okay, so Charlie, are you catching this?
Okay, so it gives you a sense of what we hear.
Sounds very reasonable. The values we had were very rounded. Are these kind of approximate
This is
values,
Eric
or
Blake. He's one of the
were those the
American
exact
specialists
measured
there.
values?
Confirming
We had
the word
90
report.
knots gusting to 120 knots.
Over.
We did that
Roger.
they confirmed.
Okay, do either of you have anything more before we
This is
close
Dr.
this
Jim
circuit?
Hirschman, and he passed away a few months ago. He's a cardiologist, head of one of the big hospitals, and he was one of our hurricane operators since the first year that we started this.
Eric is from here.
Oh, really? That's right, yeah. So anyway, oops, hit the wrong button. So why do we volunteer? Well, this is why you guys are here. You volunteer because you care. You know, you use your special skills, which are very unique. You know, you tell people, I'm a ham radio operator, or I'm an amateur radio operator. And the word amateur is just because we don't get paid. But we have special skills, very unique skills. We can put radios together, put wire antennas up in trees, and talk to the rest of the world when sometimes satellites don't get through. So, and this is why everybody's here, and this is why everybody cares, is because we want to do whatever we can to help those that are hit by a hurricane. And I'm convinced, otherwise I wouldn't have volunteered for 43 years. I'm convinced that what you all do actually helps save lives in the end. So thank you very much. Okay, now we're going to switch over. We'll leave that up and introduce Dan.
Yeah, I talked to Dan. We're going to take a break first, and then he's going to come up.
Okay.
That would work for schedule. All right, folks, I know that the break is usually between 10 and 10:30, and it's about 10:15 now, and I talked to Dan, and he doesn't have any immediate schedule conflicts, so we'll take the short break now. If you could come back promptly at 10:30, that'll be great, so about a 15-minute break, and then we'll have Dan Brown, the senior hurricane specialist, talk about the importance of surface reports from amateur radio.
Establish the link.
So in typical style, our 15-minute break turned into about 25 minutes, but that's to be expected. So our next speaker, we're glad to have from the National Hurricane Center, Senior Hurricane Specialist Dan Brown, is going to take a few minutes to talk about the importance of amateur radio surface reports during hurricanes. Dan?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So thanks. Good morning. I don't have any slides, so I'll just talk here. I took a few notes, and I really appreciate Julio's presentation because it brought back a fair number of memories for me. I haven't been at NHC all the way back to 1980, but I did start there in 1993. Certainly have seen Julio and all the ham operators at NHC for a long period of time. Know some of the stories we were talking about, some other stories which I didn't know about, which are great. But it's interesting because as a forecaster, we never want to see these storms to make landfall and impact people's lives, but we know that they do. And so it's just extremely important to get the information, the situational awareness of what's going on the ground. And yes, as forecasters, we sometimes are still excitable. Even myself. Again, it can be little things, like you mentioned, the wind direction. It can be little things like that that help us to understand, where the storm's located and help us do our jobs. One thing too, I would mention that. So I'm the warning coordination meteorologist there, and also one of the senior hurricane specialists. And so I get to work a lot with both the local National Weather Service offices as well as folks throughout the Caribbean. And just last week, I was at our first in-person meeting, thankfully, since 2019, of the Hurricane Committee that meets to talk about how we coordinate, how we're trying to make sure people have the information to make decisions, and it's where the names do get retired and replaced. So we did that last week. But I mention that because, again, your work not only helps folks here in the United States, but also in the Caribbean. And, I know hurricanes that hit some of these very remote areas, there might be a ham operator that can, again, provide that piece of information to us, situational awareness. And I didn't even realize some of the stories about how you all also have provided help connecting, government officials and others to those areas to get that. I did look. It was funny you mentioned some recent storms, and you talked about Stacy Stewart. He is retired, but was always a very big proponent of the program. And I looked at one of his. In fact, I think it was the final report he wrote before he retired. He did mention an amateur radio report from Hurricane Iota in Nicaragua, and that was the highest wind report I think we had for that storm. It was 108 knots, which is about 120 or 122 miles an hour. Again, that information and that work is so crucial to what we do. When you look back too and think about how technology changes, you go back to, say, Hurricane Mitch, 1998. Of course, that's before we all had cell phones, walking around with basically computers in our pockets. That storm stalled over Central America and unfortunately took about 9,000 lives. It was one of the biggest losses of life in hurricanes in the 20th century. But we moved forward, and we had Katrina. So technologies, that was sort of maybe right around the start of the cell phone, maybe not quite smartphone, but at least the cell phone era. That storm took 1,400 or so lives. And you even move forward to today, something more recent like Maria in Puerto Rico. Again, a lot of those weren't direct fatalities, but they were indirect after the storm, about 3,000 lives. So again, it just shows the importance of making sure that we have communications both before, during, and after the storms. And it's so critical to have that. And so again, I thank you all for everything that you do for that, because I know it helps not only us, but helps those first responders. And again, it provides that situational awareness for us at the Hurricane Center. And it can be things from, damage reports can be quite helpful, in real time, and then also after the fact. If you're not real familiar with the Hurricane Center. We actually issue what we call tropical cyclone reports on every storm that we have in the Atlantic and Pacific. The ones that strike land are much more lengthy, much more thorough. The idea behind those reports is to provide the historical perspective, the climatological record for the hurricane. So we end up going back and reanalyzing. We look at all the data. We actually comb through the reports that you all provide to us. Again, looking for those peak winds, the rainfall, storm surge information. And then we have a section where we actually talk about the damage and destruction, loss of life. And again, it's to document that information so that we as forecasters and as the weather community can start to maybe better message these events. How can we reach people? You know, recently with some studies from Dr. Ed Rappaport, who retired, talked about both direct and indirect fatalities. And we're losing so many even folks after the storm that we're trying to do a lot more messaging after the storm. And again, any information you're getting can help us with that. If we know what's caused some of the fatalities, we can try to message that for the next storm and ensure folks are staying safe. But I go back to real quick here about the observations, and I would say, don't think any observation is too small, or maybe not, you don't think it's that important, but relay it, because it might be. A simple wind direction can be helpful. The wind itself is incredibly important. Knowing how strong and even estimates of that can be helpful. But one that I really do ask you a lot for, if you have them, is pressure. The minimum pressure can be incredibly important. It doesn't tell us, maybe directly how strong it is, but it really can be important after the fact to understand the intensity, how deep the storm was when it made landfall. And I know a storm like Andrew, I think it was some ham reports and others from the public that we got after the fact that we realized how strong it was, because again, the aircraft didn't measure it right near landfall. So those pressure observations are really important. And if you do have a pressure observation, if you get one, try to estimate whether the winds are calm or whether there's still some wind blowing, because that's helpful too. If we know that you get a minimum pressure and the wind was calm, the eye was probably directly overhead, it can be helpful versus one where there's still some wind blowing and you're not maybe directly in the center of the storm or the eye. So all of that information, is incredibly important. I really commend you all, commend Julio for volunteering for the many years that he has, and all of you. Again, it's vital. I can't tell you enough. It's just vitally important to have for us to build these relationships, to get the information, and to make sure we're all in this, doing this together, trying to save lives, trying to help people prepare for the storms, make sure they're safe during the storm, and then, like I mentioned, staying safe afterwards. And that's something that we can't forget, that piece either. When you look at a storm like Ian, we released support this morning. There were 90 indirect fatalities. Almost all those were in Florida. And again, it's making sure people are doing the right thing after the event. So we'll keep that messaging up as well. That's about all I have, but I can certainly take some questions. If anybody is real curious about anything at NHC, I'm happy to answer anything you might have.
One thing, keep on stressing these storm surges, because they will damage more homes and kill more people than the wind will. We saw that happen on the Gulf Coast during Katrina. 23-foot storm surge wiped out absolutely every house that was on a slab in Gulfport, all the way back to that hit Lake Charles.
Unfortunate, it hit a very populated area, so a lot of people did get out, thankfully. But we wish we would have had fewer number of fatalities because some people did not heed those warnings and leave. And so again, I appreciate you bringing that up. So, hey, Jeff, come here.
Yeah, I live in Plaquemines Parish, and I'd like to reinforce what he said about storm surge. Katrina, we had a house just above Empire, a big sprawling house, wound up being moved over a quarter-mile, blocked both northbound lanes of 23, the entire median, which is about 4 lanes wide, and one of the southbound lanes. And it was there for quite a while. On the east bank, we had buildings picked up and literally left on the levee.
Yeah, I have seen storm damage oftentimes from the air, and I did make it here to Louisiana about a year ago, and it was several months after Ida, and we also went to Lake Charles area, and there was still a lot of visible damage from Laura, which had been about 18 months sooner. But this year was the first time that I actually had a chance to go on the ground almost immediately after. And in this past decade, we've started to see more improvements than we had before, which is a good thing. And more importantly, just really in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen somewhat significant improvements in forecasting rapid strengthening, which we had not seen for a very long period of time. A lot of that's probably advancements in some of the computer models that we're using. I think some forecaster recognition, the fact we've had so much experience in the last few years. So for Ida last year, for Ian this year, we both, we predicted rapid strengthening to occur in both the storms, and it happened. So I think there's a lot of hope that we're making some progress with that. I'm not sure we're going to see as big a gains with track forecasting in the near future because I think we're running what's called limits of predictability, that there's just, atmosphere is chaotic. So at some point we're probably going to reach where we may not see much more improvement, and we may be starting to reach that at least for some of the short-term forecasts. But again, I think additional lead time, you'll probably see extension at some point to 6 and 7 day forecasts. We're doing our tropical weather outlook this year out to day 7, which is an extension. And it was in 2010 that we actually did extend the lead time of our watches and warnings with some of the improvements in track forecasting, that those were extended out to 36 and 48 hours. So there's been a lot of work in that, but there's still some areas to improve even further. So, any other questions or comments? I'll be around this week if you're here. So, say hello, introduce yourself, and say hi. So appreciate the time, and thanks so much, Julio. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so next on the agenda, I'll be presenting the VoIP Hurricane Net. So how many folks are familiar with the amateur radio VoIP Hurricane Net? Okay, so a few folks, but still a number that are not familiar. So I'm going to take you through the VoIP Hurricane Net. I'm going to talk about some of the technology. Then I'm going to get into some of the amateur radio net activations and some of the other things that we do, because we obviously are looking for the direct surface reports from amateur radio operators in the affected area, but there's a lot of other things that we can do as amateur operators, both locally and even in other parts of the country that aren't getting the hurricane, to help. And I'm going to talk through a lot of those stories in this presentation. So we activate supporting WX4 NHC at the amateur radio station at the National Hurricane Center. We use the National Weather Service, United States National Weather Service Sky One reporting criteria on what we send to the Hurricane Center. We can do a lot of interoperability with various agencies, emergency operations centers, Red Cross, Salvation Army, National Weather Service offices, etc. We have liaison operations that may be on Echolink, IRLP, and I'll also talk about how we're starting to get to use more VoIP modes, and we're really hopeful, and we've said this for a couple years now, but I think now the technology's really evolved, according to our technical coordinator, VK3 JED, Tony, to be able to bring all of the VoIP modes in together. We also do a lot of work with a lot of the online weather stations, the APRS CWAP stations, Davis weather stations, there's Tempest weather flow stations, there's the personal weather stations on Weather Underground. There are lots of weather stations out there, and the problem is trying to monitor all the important ones that we can give to the Hurricane Center. And then certainly we can put out the advisories on our network. You see we're on the star WX talk star Echolink conference, node 7203, IRLP 9219, and as we'll talk about, we're trying to get on other modes all at the same time as well. We activate when the NHC is on the air, and we have some means, hopefully amateur radio, but any means to get them information and reports, and it's all those other means that we've talked about. And that includes other VoIP modes beyond Echolink and IRLP. We can self-activate if agencies want our help. We can self-activate our net to help them. And we do have other backup systems that we use as well. We monitor the tropics closely, all the different tropical weather outlooks, the different statements, the special tropical weather outlooks. We also have had situations, especially in the 2005 to 2010 timeframe, where we had a few sneaky hurricanes kind of intensify unexpectedly, and we brought our net up to get reports and get them to the Hurricane Center, and Julio and team were able to accept them. You know, Hurricane Emily was one where Grenada got hit very hard. It was supposed to be a hurricane. We can't actually cancel the activation because it looked like it wasn't going to get there, and we got a surprise overnight when it got there, and Grenada took it on the chin. Now they had issues, damage at the hospital, a lot of issues on the island. We sent the report to the Hurricane Center. I can remember I was up through the night, and I went to sleep around 5 a.m., and I woke up at 11 a.m. with the AP news article of the damage at the Grenada Hospital that obviously came through our amateur radio network. So some of the things that can happen. We have a chat that we use on the app Telegram for our net control chat that we do to coordinate things. And we try to prepare folks ahead of the season to be able to participate, both with our regular nets. We are monthly on the first Saturday of each month in December through May, and then we meet weekly in the hurricane season months of June through November. And that information's right here, 0000 hours UTC, which is actually on the Sunday, but by local time in North America, it's Saturday evening. I talked about the time of when we meet during the various parts of the season. And our net activations can run quite a bit differently through the weekly net. And sometimes they are very quiet. Doesn't mean that we're not there, though. Because what's, I think, really good thing is the information now and the folks that check in and give information, they're giving correct, appropriate information and not a lot of extraneous information. So sometimes, even though it seems very quiet, it's like, oh, there's nothing going on. There's actually stuff that can go on. It's just the information is very streamlined to that Skywarn reporting criteria. Some different tips on making sure you check your audio. We do have a system that we kick out folks if they're have their conference enabled for Echolink, and that's because just to avoid unintentional interference, we can make exceptions. The local system here, through the Crescent City Amateur Radio Group, we actually allow the conference to be enabled because Joe and the team do a great job of making sure that unintentional interference doesn't happen. There are ways, if you're on Echolink, to repeat, like courtesy, to prevent courtesy tones and repeater IDs from coming over the network, and Tony, our technical coordinator, can help with that. The All-Star network can come in through the Echolink side as well, so we can get that mode connected into our operations as well. The latest version of the PC software it had been updated a few times in 2021, and that remains the latest software for Echolink, so just wanted to mention that. I noticed the Droid app was updated on 3/24, and the Apple app was actually still back in 2021, although there's also the Echo Ham, which I didn't include here that I should include going forward. I know is updated. they updated it recently, but I don't suggest that update because they're having some issues. But I am running the latest Droid one, and I haven't had any problems. One of the things I want to mention, we have been bringing in other VoIP modes through Tony's Megalink system over the last couple of years. So it allows the connection of all the things that you see here on the right-hand side. So All-Star, DMR, with some peculiarities around Brandmeister, D-Star, YSF, NXDN, P25, M17. And our goal for this year, and we said it the last couple of years, I think there still were some technical gotchas in the installation. Tony actually reached out to me a few weeks ago through some help from Lloyd, KC5FM, who's one of our net management team members, to say, Rob, this can be the year. I can get this going. There's a couple things I need you to do, and then I can take it from here. So what we're hoping to do is on the start or shortly after the hurricane season to get all these modes integrated into our network, in addition to Echolink and IRLP. So hopefully we'll be successful. We have time to do it. But obviously there's day jobs and life that could get in the way, but that's what we're going to try to do here over the next couple of months. And then one of the other things, right, is there's a lot of other forms of communication there. I know here in the New Orleans area, there's a Zello channel. We've used that a bit to communicate. I've mentioned a lot of the chat programs, WhatsApp, Telegram, Slack, Signal. I could go on and on. But those are some of the key popular ones. All the social media that's out there, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Yes, I know there's controversies with TikTok, but there's a lot of information on TikTok and something we consider. All the online weather stations. What about all the public safety feeds, whether you have a local scanner or you actually have a public safety feed connected on the internet? We can gather a lot of raw data from those areas. And with the internet public safety feeds, right, we can have a ham in Wisconsin monitor it, get us reports from the affected area, and that can be very useful. We cite the source information, we give them the raw data, how we collected it, we can get it to the Hurricane Center. And the Weather Service, I think, has really kind of shifted on that approach. There used to be a time, well, that's secondhand information. Well, I can tell you, the offices now realize if it's done correctly, you get that first responder on scene who says, yes, I have this tree down, or I got 10 trees down, and I have roofs off of homes. Understanding it's kind of the initial ground assessment, and there can be kind of the fog of war or the fog of the situation that can confuse things. It's really helpful to get that information and that raw information in near real time. So something that we've done, and we as amateur radio operators, we know how to discern those communications and be able to provide that information. We have a lot of hams, they may only be able to operate from home. This is a role that some of those hams can help with if they're trained properly. And we've actually done a little bit of training up in southern New England about how to properly do these things, also how to properly monitor online weather stations and such. One other thing I've been experimenting with is these network radios. I mean, you ever try to get Echolink going and you're trying to monitor a public safety feed, you're trying to do, you want to do Zello, you tie up your phone with Zello and everything else. Well, there's these network radios out there. This handheld here is about $200 on Amazon. This is about $269 on Amazon. It's like a base or mobile type rig. And you can do all these things. Echolink, Zello, monitor public safety feeds. You can load some level of apps. And that allows you to not tie up your cell phone. You can connect to Wi-Fi. You can use it like it's a radio. And I've used this a few times during activations, the handheld. I just recently bought this and sadly have not configured it yet, and I've had it for a few months. But these are things too that might be things you consider to augment your capabilities in your area, and they're relatively affordable. So we have tried to turn our net into this virtual communications, virtual situational awareness support. So providing all the reports we can from all these mediums we've talked about, the social media, the public safety feeds, the weather stations, along with directly from the amateur community. And we'd love to get everything through the direct amateur radio community, but everybody's got a lot of roles with their local groups, etc. One of the things we like to encourage local Aries groups, and it's done very well here in New Orleans, is have your local nets, or connect to us indirectly if you want, or if you don't want to do that, can you send a station or two to give us your reports every 30 minutes, every hour, at some regular frequency so we can know what's going on. And that provides that great situational awareness picture, not only at the local level, but then to the state and then to the federal level. Gets the Weather Service on the same page with emergency management. And when you get that great situational awareness picture, it becomes very powerful. So these are a number of the net activations. You can see 2020 was very active. 2021, we're going to talk about Ida, of course. We're in New Orleans. We've got to talk about Ida. I'm not going to steal Matt's thunder, though, I promise. And then we'll talk through the amateur radio nets during these activations from this year. And it's interesting because the name systems were a little lower than what they thought, but we were pretty darn busy this year still. And if you look at it, Fiona, we were active like 4 different times. Ian, we were active 2 different times. Luckily with Julia, Lisa, and Nicole, it was only an actual 1 landfall point. So this is my opportunity to give a shout out to, and I was hoping Joe would be here by the time I presented, but I know he will be coming a bit later, but want to give a shout out to Joe and the Crescent City Amateur Radio Group because you guys have been partners with us since Hurricane Gustav in 2008, so that's 15 years. We've worked a number of hurricanes. We worked Gustav, we worked Isaac and Ida, the ones that stick out the most in my mind, and we always got very good information. We had the Hammond, Louisiana Fire Department, Ham embedded with the fire department, giving us direct reports on a continual basis. Joe was giving reports. We have Rick in the room, a number of you guys all giving reports that we gave to Julio and the Hurricane Center, in addition to a lot of the other monitoring. This was a Davis weather station at the Grand Isle, Louisiana EOC with 146 mile per hour wind gusts. We had wind gusts from other Davis weather stations well over 100 miles per hour in parts of New Orleans, and that caused tremendous damage. And many of you I know suffered damage from Ida, and we hope that, you know, now about a year and a half in that folks have recovered. These are some of the pictures, these are some of the credits here for some of the photos here. And there are lots more that could do it justice, but some of the damage from Ida, and obviously wanted to cover that being local to New Orleans here. So now we'll talk about the ones from this year. So this was Hurricane Fiona, obviously significant damage, storm surge, flooding, in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, then it went up to the Turks and Caicos Islands, then it went to Bermuda, and we have a separate section about Atlantic Canada because it deserves a separate section. But here are some of the wind gusts. And these were Davis weather stations here, 110 miles per hour in Ponce, 113 miles per hour in Yaco, Puerto Rico, and I probably butchered the name of that, 100 miles per hour in South Caicos. Look at here, this was an online Davis weather station that's run by a ham. We didn't hear from the ham on the frequency, but his station was online, and we're taking in those reports and sending them up. And you can see here, close to 100 mile per hour wind gusts in Bermuda. And look at this rainfall. This was from an APRS weather station. Raphael has his station online. We saw that rainfall. We sent it into the center. These are some of the pictures. We had Francisco, November Papa 3 Oscar Delta in San Juan, gathering social media information for us, listening to some of the other radio, the local radio, et cetera. These are some of the damage, some of the significant flooding in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, from the emergency management there. These are some of the conditions that we saw right in Puerto Rico. Now let's talk about Atlantic Canada. So I can tell you, being in New England, if this had tracked, if a cold front had timed itself differently or interacted with it differently, Fiona could have been a New England problem like the 38 hurricane. In the 1938 hurricane in New England, we had wind gusts up to 186 miles per hour at Blue Hill. It would have been devastating for our area. Instead, we got a front that gave it a little bit of a nudge to Atlantic Canada, to some of the folks in this room who experienced it. And these were some of the wind gusts. I mean, 111 miles per hour here in, and I'm going to probably butcher the name, Arseg, Nova Scotia. So these were some of the high wind gusts, Grand Etang, 104 miles per hour. Notice these are all APRS CWAP reports. And then there's Emile, VE1EP. So Dennis Dura, one of our assistant director of operations for the Hurricane Center, did a lot of outreach to Atlantic Canada, and Emile was giving us many reports from Halifax, and he had his own weather station. And by the way, 73 mile per hour gust in Halifax was the highest gust I could find in Halifax, and it was from that amateur radio operator, and he gave us a lot of damage reports as well. Look at these other wind gusts. There's the Isle of Madeline in Quebec, 91 miles per hour. It's like right in between those provinces. So again, tremendous wind gusts, tremendous damage, and the wide area that it was. So it had the intensity and the size. Bob was able to do an interview on the Weather Channel with Jim Cantori, which I was able to help with, and he did a tremendous job describing that to folks in the States about what Canada, Atlantic Canada, was about to experience. And it was really great to see that on the Weather Channel. So here's some of the damage reports. BE1JBL in Titness Bridge, Nova Scotia, with these photos here. Look at how these trees are snapped right to the ground, right at the base. It just tells you the kind of winds we were getting all the way to the ground. This is from a ham who's actually in New Hampshire, had friends and family up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. These are the utility poles that are down. So here's an example. It's a ham in New Hampshire. He's got friends in Nova Scotia. We actually got that report from him, and we got similar reports from Emil, because Dartmouth is not far from Halifax. And that's the other thing Emil was doing. He was monitoring his local public safety and sending in those reports. We were using Broadcastify feeds, monitoring that area, trying to gather reports. This was up in Marshville, Nova Scotia. So these homes, I think a lot of this was storm surge, but some of this was also the winds. Look at the destruction here. We talk about what we see on the Gulf Coast, parts of the U.S. East Coast. Well, this is what you're seeing up here in Atlantic Canada. This is Ellen Sutherland's cousin, who's a friend of KI1U, Mike Corey, sending us this information and pictures about a day after it happens. Pretty incredible. Let's talk about Ian. Same kind of approach. We did have hams from the area directly reporting in as well. And we got some good storm surge information, some power outage and damage reports. But again, we also had hams up in New England. I know one ham in Kentucky putting out information, some of it sending to us on social media. And one of the interesting things that happened also is I'm on NWS chat because I watch some of the information that's coming into the local offices. And then all of a sudden I get a contact from our science officer, Joe Della Carpini, saying, Rob, I'm on the virtual team sending reports into the local NWS offices. I know you run the amateur radio hurricane net. Could you tell me what you hear from your net or anything you get from social media? Because I want to send it into the local offices. This is the first time I've ever had my local office come to me and say, hey, we're doing this support. Can you help us? So for about 6 hours that he was on shift, we were sending information not only to the Hurricane Center, but also to our local office to send to the offices in the affected area. And I think we're going to see more of this. So this is going to be a new thing I think we're going to be doing. So we did a lot of that support as well. We also found reports in Cuba on social media, including pictures of a spotter getting this rainfall report. And you see some of the wind gusts as well. Look at some of the wind gusts here, 140 miles per hour at the Cape Coral Yacht Club, 132 miles per hour at Port Charlotte. And this was a local ham monitoring a weather station. I'm trying to monitor as many weather stations as I can. He had taken a presentation that I gave about doing this type of work. So he was monitoring this station and he flagged me down, Rob, I just got this report here. We submitted it to the Hurricane Center. And I think this was one of the ones, these two were a couple of the ones that were used in the actual Hurricane Center advisories. So here's Cuba, some of the damage, Pinar del Rio, San Juan y Martinez. This is the spotter I was talking about, getting the rainfall reports here. Here's some of the damage. And again, we use social media to get some of this information and get this into the center. Some of the reports here, most of this is from Fort Myers. Last report on the coastal flooding is from Cape Coral. This was actually a ham from my local area. It was actually on a Red Cross deployment, got me a few damage photos, so I provided some of those here. I pulled down a lot more from social media as well, but you can see it's just a small sampling of the destruction, the storm surge, et cetera, that happened with Ian in Florida. And then it affected the Carolinas with conditions here of Category 1 hurricane strength. And then who do I hear from? But I hear from Francisco from San Juan. Why am I hearing from him? Well, his brother happens to live in Georgetown, South Carolina. And so he sent us these videos. And reason they're not playing, but it's not that important. You can kind of get a good idea here. This is the kind of flooding he was getting from the heavy rainfall, from a river that got out of its banks in Georgetown. Again, sent that to the Hurricane Center. It got into the Weather Service as well. This is from the Surf City, North Carolina Police Department, which was putting a lot of this information and photos out on social media. So we made sure that information got to them as well. This was Hurricane Julia, Nicaragua. Again, you know, you heard Dan Brown mention from IOTA some of the reports that we got from this same CREN group, and we got reports from them again. They have an EchoLink conference. We didn't have a lot of activity on WX Talk, but we sent some of our folks to monitor. So we had CU3AU from the Azores and Francisco from San Juan help translate and get us reports from Nicaragua. We then also used social media to help provide some more of that information. Notice some of the widespread phone and power outages in Bluefields, Nicaragua, where the system made landfall. So again, some of the amateur radio work here. And then there was Belize, where we had direct EchoLink all-star connections right into our net. We got a number of reports from the hams there on the conditions, and again, augmented it with social media photos, some of the damage, some of the coastal and inland flooding. You can see the roof here coming off of this building. We had about 25 reports coming in. Again, we did use Davis and Tempest weather flow sensors, as you imagine, in this area, not as many as other parts of the country or the North America region, and you can see some of the photo credits here. So again, we had the amateur radio piece, we had direct contact with them, the internet connections were able to hold up well enough where we got some good reports in before they started to become unreliable. And then there was here in Florida with Hurricane Nicole. Biggest thing was the beach erosion and the coastal flooding, but they did have at least wind gusts to hurricane force at the Daytona Beach Beach Safety Headquarters and one of the NASA towers as well. And then notice this ham report from APRS in Sebastian, Florida, of severe criteria. So we're preparing for this year with Tony's technology, as I mentioned. We're always looking for net control, stations in the affected area or stations outside the affected area that can monitor a lot of these modes that we've talked about. The WX4 NHC communications test will be Saturday, May 28th. More information to follow as we get into early May. We're trying to look at net control training. Also, again, always looking for stations in the affected area. Continue to work kind of that virtual situational awareness model that we've talked about. I'm going to fly through the best practices in Skywarn, but I want to make the point of, even if the hurricane is not on the air and the system's not a hurricane, tropical storms cause a lot of these same hazards, and sometimes the difference between a strong tropical storm and a Category 1 hurricane is very minimal. So it's important at the local regional level that you have your active Skywarn nets or your active ARIES or whatever form of emergency communications net, depending on your area, to kind of cover these systems, because they can cause a lot of issues. And up in our latitudes, up in the Northeast in Canada, when they go tropical to post-tropical, it can actually enhance the impacts of those systems. So it doesn't have to be a hurricane to be a problem at the local regional level, whether the Hurricane Center is active on air and our hurricane nets are active or not. We had Tropical Storm Henri in southern New England in 2021. It was supposed to become a hurricane. It fell short, but the hurricane nets were actually active because of this. We sent in all this information. We had wind gusts to 70 miles per hour. Rhode Island was hardest hit with 90,000 without power. We had flash flooding issues. We were working with our local weather service office. You can see some of the pictures and some of the credits here for the different, and this is the kind of wind damage we were getting. I live in New Bedford, Mass, near the South Coast. I could find damage very close to my house that I was taking photos of. We sent all this information to the Hurricane Center, and here's Stacy Stewart. Thank you for these observations. They're extremely helpful. They were put in the public advisory, passing on as thanks to the radio net. And that also got back to our local weather service. Stacy mentioned to our office, hey, I know you're getting the reports. We're getting the same reports. They all have the same situational awareness operational picture. So very helpful. And by the way, with Ida, and I left this slide in for a reason, it paid a visit to southern New England as well. I had at my house close to 9 inches of rain in New Bedford. I had 8.61 on my Davis. The EMA director, a friend of mine, called me and said, Rob, we had some of the wastewater treatment plant facilities measure 9 inches of rain as well. This is the kind of flooding in my community. We were lucky that we had about a 90-minute gap, or we probably would have had evacuations and stuff. It gave it just enough time to drain out enough that we didn't have a catastrophic type of flood, but we had the worst flooding since frontal zone interacted with Hurricane Arthur, and that was in the 2014 timeframe. So this was the flooding we had. We had an EF1 tornado on Cape Cod during this, and also microbursts. This was out in the Yarmouth area. So this was the remnants of Ida. We were active through the night supporting our local weather office with these issues. This was a major nor'easter that some questioned whether or not it had some tropical characteristics. It was like a Category 1 hurricane strike for parts of southeast Mass, where we had this type of damage here. We had wind gusts 90 over 100 miles per hour. There's a story on the League that gets into detail. There wasn't any hurricane warnings because of the type of system it was, but it was hurricane-type impacts for our area. So trying to emphasize that, look, we want local and regional groups to be active for these events. And it's also good practice for when you do have a hurricane to then bring that information up to our hurricane nets, to the amateur radio station at the Hurricane Center, being that trusted source to your local weather service office and potentially emergency management and media that want that information. Be that force multiplier to provide that information, and then it's easy to switch into the communications emergency mode if those comms go down. These links are all about Everlink, IRLP, VoIPWX.net for our website, our social media, Facebook and Twitter feeds here. We also have a Groups.io email list, and then we could certainly help with any of the technical issues or anything you want to learn about our amateur radio VoIP hurricane net, and then all this other work we do with the monitoring of the various other modes. I'll leave this slide up for a second. This is my contact info and some of our staff members of the hurricane net management team that we work together very closely. Dennis also does Skywarn in the New Jersey area, Debbie in the Illinois area, Lloyd in Oklahoma, so a lot of experience from our group here. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll take that quick question.
Yeah, two quick questions.
Yeah.
One, I have an active weather report going into the Weather Underground.
Yes.
Would it do you any good for it to also be APRS?
Yes, it would, because think of if you lose internet, but you still have the amateur radio capability, it'll still transmit out. We should still be able to get that information.
Okay, the other question is, you indicated that there's a problem with brandmeisters. Is there a workaround on that?
So the way Tony kind of put it was that can be sometimes an issue depending on the Brandmeister network. I know their rules are kind of a little loose, so I'll get more detail from Tony on what that means, but I think it sounds like we've had Brandmeister DMR in, but I think it may be system or network dependent on how it could get in.
Weather service.
Yep.
To the COVID issue. So during the hurricane, we lost internet access at the Covington EOC, and we couldn't talk to the weather service anymore.
Yeah, and that was one of my biggest fears with the whole COVID situation is the situation that you had, where things get bad enough at the local level where we aren't able to get the information to them. And we dodged a couple bullets in New England. Luckily now we're out of that, so hopefully we'll have that connection kind of going forward. All right, so with that, I think we'll keep moving here, but thanks for the questions. We will have a Q&A at the end, so if you think of others, you can ask them there. I'm now going to turn it over to a guy who's had a very, very busy week and has been with us on these workshops for many years now. Whiskey Bravo 8 Bravo Zulu Hotel, Bill Feast. Bill just got through with a deployment for the Mississippi tornado outbreak and has done a tremendous job with that and still managed to get here to present for us today. And so he deserves a lot of rest after this presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and it's great to have him here.
Thank you, Rob.
Before you get away, is there a clicker that,
It is right here. This is your laser, and those are up and down.
Okay. All right. Well, as Rob said, my name is Bill Feast, and I am the Southern Territory Coordinator for Saturn, or the Salvation Army Team Emergency Radio Network. And I have just got back from a one-week deployment in Mississippi, rotated out yesterday, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. What I really want to do is to begin let's see, maybe it's this way. No? There we go. Okay. I want to talk some about the Salvation Army. You know, my hunch is, when you think of the Salvation Army, how many of you think of kettles at Christmas time, the bell ringers at Christmas time? Yeah, that's what most people think of. And if it's not that, it's thrift stores, okay? So I want to talk a little bit about the Salvation Army so that you know our organization a little bit better and where we fit into all of this with disaster services and the likes. First of all, you need to understand the Salvation Army is an international church, okay, an international organization. It's in 132 countries around the world. Our international headquarters is located in London, England. And international headquarters provides regulations for the Salvation Army. I have to read off of this because my memory is really lousy. So anyways, it provides international regulations for Salvation Army operations around the world in order to provide just kind of a worldwide consistency to the Army. Being in 132 countries, you can imagine there's lots of room for inconsistency to pop up. It also supports each subordinate part of the Salvation Army with additional services and resources as needed. So from the map, you can see that globally, the Salvation Army is broken up into 5 zones, okay? The red zone, of course, is Africa. The Americas and the Caribbean is in blue. Europe's in kind of the yellow. Southeast Asia and Middle East are in the brown, and the South Pacific and East Asia are in purple. Now, Salvation Army zones are divided into territories, okay? And the territory, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. So with the exception of rules and regulations mandated by IHQ, the territories are allowed to make rules and regulations that make sense for their part of the world, because we understand that different parts of the world operate differently. In the United States, the U.S. is divided into 4 territories. You can see them there on the map: Eastern, Central, Western, and Southern. Obviously, we're in the Southern Territory here. And each territory is a legally separate corporation under U.S. law. National headquarters for the United States is in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., and provides support for the four territories. I'm talking too fast once in a while. Point of contact for it also serves as a point of contact for national level government, companies, and nonprofit partners. Nationwide rules and regulations to maintain, again, some consistency nationally are developed through national headquarters, but they can only be made with a unanimous vote of the 4 territorial commanders or commissioners and the national commander. If the vote's not unanimous, then it is not a national regulation, and each territory can either adopt that or not, as they choose. Territories, in turn, are divided into divisions, and you can see the 8 divisions here of the Southern Territory as an example. Divisions in the U.S. can be part of a state, all of a state, multiple states, and you can see that, again, we're in the Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi division, and that's obviously 3 states put together, and our headquarters is in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, divisions are managed by their divisional headquarters, and they can make rules and regulations for the Salvation Army within their division, as long as they don't conflict with rules and regulations from higher headquarters like territorial or international headquarters. Divisions, in turn, have three different kinds of local units. There are corps. These are local churches, and we are a church, by the way, and they have traditional church programs, like social services, disaster services, church services on Sundays, and many other programs depending upon the needs of the area they're in. Again, it can be different throughout the country. Some corps may not provide one thing, and other corps may not provide something else. Then there are service extension centers. These are physical locations in smaller rural towns and cities that provide social services and disaster services, but they do not do any church functions because they're not a church. They're more of a social services and services organization. And in fact, the Mississippi Delta, where we had the majority of the tornadoes here in Mississippi over the last week, actually happened in a service extension area, and divisional headquarters stepped in and helped them out with additional resources. Local units, again, manage their programs locally within the parameters set by divisional headquarters and all the headquarters that go on up the scale. Now, to understand the Salvation Army, you really do have to understand, there we go. You really do have to understand the Army's mission. First of all, the Salvation Army is not a social services organization. Even social services, and even though we are one of the largest nonprofit social services organizations in the world, we're not a social services organization. We're not a disaster services organization. Yes, we do lots of disaster services, both domestically in the U.S. and internationally. And it's all kinds of disaster services. We are currently involved in providing help to the refugees from the war in Ukraine, and all the way down to what we did this last week in the Mississippi Delta. But we're not a disaster organization. We're a church. Here's our mission statement, and I'm just going to read it real quick. Salvation Army, an international movement, part of the Universal Christian Church. Its message is based on the Bible. Its ministry is motivated by the love of God. Its mission is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to meet human needs in His name without discrimination. So we have really a dual mission in the Salvation Army. Oops. There we go. Again, I've mentioned this a couple of times. The Salvation Army is a church. Our denomination is known as Salvationists. You see, I wear the uniform. I'm a lay member of the church. I am a Salvationist, just like if you're in the Baptist church, you're a Baptist, or if you're in the Methodist church, you're a Methodist. We're Salvationists. Local churches are called corps. Kind of goes with the military theme that the Salvation Army has gone with since it was first formed in 1865. You hear them talk about officers. Officers have red epaulets on their shoulders. There are pastors and clergy. They are ordained clergy in the Salvationist Church. Lay members, like myself, we're known as soldiers, and we wear blue epaulets on our shoulder, and that's how you tell the difference between us. Salvation Army staff and volunteers do not have to be members of or affiliated with the Salvation Army in any way. Even though I am, most actually are not affiliated with the Army other than that they're an employee of the Army or a volunteer with the Army. So, disaster management. If you remember back during the mission statement, it says that the second mission is to meet human needs in His name without discrimination. Now, although the Salvation Army, again, is not a disaster services organization, it does respond to many disasters throughout the world. For the Salvation Army, meeting human needs is simply another way of preaching the gospel. St. Francis of Assisi once said, "I witness for Christ all the time, and sometimes I even use words." We do it through our actions. Along that same idea, Billy Graham once described the Salvation Army as Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. That's us, okay? It's all about the action. It's all about the service. The services of the Salvation Army provides for emergency disaster services, or what we call EDS, varies widely around the world and even within the United States. The Salvation Army's primary missions are mass, fixed, and mobile feeding, and emotional and spiritual care. We do that for almost every disaster we go to in the United States. And the Mississippi tornadoes are a really good example of that. We served over 1,400, almost 15,000 rather, meals, 36,000 drinks, 22,000 snacks. We served a lot of food over the last week, and we're still out there serving this week. Well, there are people out there now, even though I've rotated out of the command team, there's a new command team, and they're still working out there in the field to serve people in the public. The secondary missions, bulk distribution, disaster social services, long-term recovery. Doing those often depends upon the resources that we have, okay, whether we have enough resources to be able to do that. We'd like to do that all the time. Sometimes it's just not possible. We work on the incident command system just like most organizations that are involved in emergency management, at least in the United States. We use the same system. About the only difference between the system chart that you see up there for incident command is emotional and spiritual care. You know, obviously most of your government organizations aren't going to have that as one of the positions in their incident command system, but we're a church. That's what we're all about. So that one's in there for us. Now in the Southern Territory, all of our disaster professionals, including me, I'm a retired professional with the Salvation Army. I've been retired for about 4 years now. But all of us are either certified emergency managers or associate emergency managers with the International Association of Emergency Management. Okay, and I have my lifetime certification, and all of our professionals have these. Now, one of the hallmarks of ICS is that it's scalable. You know, depending on the size of the disaster, you can scale the response up or down, depending on what's going on. Now, the response always begins locally. Okay? So we have a disaster, we'll say a hurricane, and it strikes Baton Rouge there. Okay? If the local need, and the local unit is the first one to respond. It's like any other first responder. You know, if a hurricane hits Baton Rouge, who is it that goes in first? Baton Rouge PD, Baton Rouge Fire Department, Baton Rouge Emergency Management, local chapter of the Red Cross, local chapter of the Salvation Army, and so on. It's the local folks who respond first. Now, if our local unit sees that, whoa, this is way bigger than we can handle on our own, they are going to contact divisional headquarters in Jackson. And divisional headquarters, in turn, will contact other local units within the division and ask them to start sending resources to the area of disaster. Okay? But if the disaster is big enough that divisional headquarters doesn't have enough resources to send, then they're going to contact territorial headquarters, which for us is in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia will then start contacting the other 7 divisions in the territory, and they'll start sending resources into the area. If it's so big that territorial headquarters needs additional help, guess what? They contact national headquarters, National headquarters then contacts the other 3 territories in the USA, and they all start sending resources in. And if it's a really, really big disaster, and this very rarely ever happens, but if national headquarters needs additional resources, they're going to contact international headquarters. And I've seen that happen actually a couple of times. 9/11, Katrina, those were such humongous disasters that we actually did have people coming in literally from all over the world. Whoops. And it's mostly people that come in. When it starts getting to that level, they're not sending equipment. They're sending, for the most part, people. If you think about it, we're working 2-week rotations. For Katrina, we were feeding for almost a year. After 9/11, we were feeding for 9 months. You can imagine how many people it takes to do that, and how quickly you'd run out of people in just 2-week rotations. So, oops, come on. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about Saturn. First of all, it's important to understand Saturn is not a standalone program within the Salvation Army. Okay, it's not a separate program. It is a part of the emergency disaster program. Our job is to provide emergency disaster services and the rest of the Salvation Army, when needed, with auxiliary communications. That's what we were created for. We were created by Major Patrick McPherson, WW9E, who is now a silent key, or as we say it in the Salvation Army, promoted glory. And again, it was created to give emergency communication support. Saturn is international. We've got some 2,500 registered Saturn operators throughout the United States. There's another 180 that are registered international operators, or registered in our national database. So I suspect there are more out there that are in other international databases for their countries, but I don't have access to those records. And Saturn does conduct a lot of different nets on VHF, UHF, HF. And Saturn is supported by our territorial headquarters, and there is a National Saturn Committee, which consists of the National Disaster Coordinator, the National Saturn Liaison, the 4 territorial Saturn coordinators and their assistant coordinators, if they have one, and the net manager for the international Saturn single sideband net. And we meet on a regular basis to coordinate the few national level activities that we're involved in, such as presentations here and at Dayton, as well as to share information and best practices amongst each other. Now, I mentioned that we're supported by our territories. And each territory, again, as I mentioned earlier, is separate and can make their own rules at times. Let's see. So the Central Territory, they provide mostly income support for local units or divisions for small to large scale disasters. And again, this may be on any one of the 3 different kinds of bands. It's also, we're now also starting to get into DMR and Echolink, you know, all the digital stuff, WinLink. And they also often support statewide and disaster exercises. Now here in the South, our focus is a little different. Our focus is to provide the Salvation Army IMAT, our incident management team, that goes into a disaster area and actually coordinates the activities of the Salvation Army for that particular disaster in that particular area. Our job is to go in with them and provide them with communications if they lack the normal communications because they've been taken out by the storm. You know, the times, they are changing. What was that, an old Bob Dylan song, I think? They are changing. And it's important to realize that not only do we use amateur radio, but we're learning how to use some of the other non-amateur radio resources that are out there, like UHF Business Band, mobile band kits, Starlink and other satellite resources, shares. We partner with Mars and ARRL's Ares program. And it's also sometimes possible deployed Saturn operators may sometimes be temporarily tasked with IT, some basic IT stuff. And there are times when they get tasked to just help with ordinary disaster stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with communications. I think a good example of that is when I was deployed to Michael, and they were doing a mass distribution, a drive-through distribution of water and food boxes, and it was all hands on deck. It matter if you were there for communications or you were there as the planning chief or whatever you were there for. It was all hands on deck that day because they needed everybody they could get to be helping to hand out stuff. We do have a national website, saturnusa.org. To the right, you can see the frequencies and times and dates for our international Saturn single sideband net. Note that Saturday it's a slightly different frequency because the Coast Guard net meets on 14.325 on Saturday. So we move down 5 kcs on Saturday so that we don't interfere with them. There's also a national Saturn DMR net that meets on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock Central Time, and there's all the different channels and so on. As I understand it, this is all going to be available on YouTube, so don't feel like you have to be, furiously scribbling all this down because all the information is going to be available later on. Western Territory has a Saturn single sideband net. Southern Territory has one as well. It meets on the first and third Saturday of each month on 7.268 at 9:30 in the morning on Saturday, Central Time. How many have noticed that the frequencies we're using are all hurricane watch net frequencies? Yeah, they are. And that's because we've formed a partnership with them, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. So, hurricane protocols. These are the protocols that Saturn uses to activate for hurricanes. First of all, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we do have a very strong partnership with the Hurricane WatchNet. We've developed a MOU with them and a standard operating procedure, or SOP, and this has been HWN, of course, handles weather and storm damage reports to and from the National Hurricane Center, and that's what they do. When they activate, we activate, and we come and we help them out with that, with additional operators to act as relays. Now, when the Hurricane Watch Net stands down, then if there's enough health and welfare traffic still coming into the net to warrant it, we'll stand up and continue operating, and a lot of Hurricane WatchNet operators will come and join us and help us out. So it really is a great partnership for us. It's been working very, very well. A couple of things that I want to note. Our primary job is handling health and welfare traffic. HWN, their job is the weather reports, the damage reports, that sort of thing. So they get health and welfare in, they'll ask for a Saturn operator to take that on and take care of it so that they can do their job while the Hurricane WatchNet's in session. So we handle health and welfare, that is messages that are coming out of the impacted area into the United States or wherever for delivery. We do not handle health and welfare inquiries going into a disaster area. We simply don't have the resources that it would take to go find people, person by person, in a disaster-affected area to hand them a message. We just don't have the resources for that, and so we just simply don't take those messages. We are in the process of recruiting training and credentialed net control operators. And here's how we activate the Southern Territory. We assist the Hurricane WatchNet along with the rest of the country. And we're currently recruiting credentialed operators for deployment to support our IMATs, or our incident management teams out in the field. Now, background check, so on and so forth. So it's a little bit of a process. A credentialed, ID'd disaster person, disaster volunteer with the Salvation Army. And all of our volunteers go through this, not just Saturn. All volunteers go through this. And you can see the different kinds of things that our folks do up there on the screen. I mentioned the National Saturn Committee just a little bit. Excuse me, a little bit ago. If I can get there we go. Again, the 4 territorial coordinators are members, along with the National Saturn liaison. And what I'm going to do now is give you all the contact information for those. Again, don't bother to furiously write this down. This will all be on the program when it becomes available online. And there's my information and the Assistant Territorial Coordinator for Operations information, and the information for the net manager of the International Single Sideband Net.
That's all, folks.
And that's it. We're done. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
All right, so now next up, and it's really great to have him here, and he has now been in his role a little over a year, which is good. He's got a little experience and some, the wind at his back now is Josh Johnston, Kilo Echo 5, Mike Hotel Victor. So Josh has done a great job with the management of the ARL at the headquarters level for ARES and emergency management. And he's going to talk a little bit about ARES and give an update from the national level. Josh.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you all. And of course, I get a frog in my throat as I walk up here, so that, of course. First of all, welcome to everybody. I have been at ARL at headquarters now for just over a year. I officially started the end of December of last year. Some of you may ask, does that accent that come from up north? And no, it doesn't. Neither does the 5 call sign. I'm originally from Arkansas. Served as a county emergency manager in Arkansas. I was actually in emergency management in Arkansas during Katrina and assisted with our response efforts up there. We did get a number of refugees from here in the New Orleans area and other areas, and was involved with assistance there, as well as some other events throughout the 17 years that I served as a local emergency manager. My background has always been amateur radio. I've always, once I got started there, I had a great group of Elmers, great group of hams that were like, man, well, you need to get involved in this. You need to do this. And they got me on board. And by the time I left, I was one of the guys that people would call and go, we're having a communications issue. What do you know about this? Or they would call and ask me about this and call and ask me about that. I served on the state of Arkansas communications unit working group, been through the Oxcom training, communications unit leader. So my background is communications. You find different niches. A lot of emergency managers, some of you that have worked in those roles understand you kind of find different niches, and communications was my niche, and are really very, very supportive of our amateur community back there. I'm happy to be where I'm at, and we'll just tell you, we're just getting started. Real briefly, I wanted to touch on an event we've got going on this year, year-long event that we're doing through ARL, and it's supporting and encouraging and thanking our volunteers. And there's already been some features in our monthly magazine. If you get that, talking about some of the volunteers out there, we're doing a year-long operating event But how many of you volunteer in areas or in areas, especially in any way? And I see just one over here. We've got several of you. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I was in SEC in Arkansas for a while. We had a time where I said, I'll do it, so I was serving co-role as the emergency manager or not SEC, as the local EC. So I was serving as the county emergency manager and the county emergency coordinator for Aries, support the organization, did back there. So one of the big things going with that is we're also asking people who aren't volunteering with Aries, if not me, then who? If not you, then who? Get involved. If you're not, and this room is not the ones we're talking to. So we're encouraging. One of the goals that I'm working on, and I'm going to have a packet, I hope, ready by Dayton. My plan is to have ready by Dayton, is some recruitment tools and some things to help local groups recruit. And we're going to talk about that a little more here in just a few minutes. And I'm going to keep this a little brief today, okay? I'm going to try to bias back a little bit of our time. Communications is our key. How many of you have picked up on one theme that every operator has talked about today? What is it? Communications. Needing to hear those reports, needing to hear that information, needing to get the information from the field. Whether it's little bitty, or you think it's a little bitty, or irrelevant, it's probably more relevant in most cases than you realize it is. So report those in. One of the issues we get at headquarters, Rob and Julio and I have talked about this. One of the big issues that we struggle is not getting information. We would like to have that information from all of you. The other thing that we at the headquarters, and I'm not even mentioning this, it isn't part of my presentation, we need to gather pictures. One of the things we can provide you at ARRL is reports that go out to congressional leadership, to the people in DC, at the FCC, at different places like that, to support what we do as amateur radio operators. If we can get a photograph, the picture's worth 1,000 words, absolutely accurate in that. So feel free, if you guys have a picture ever that comes up, take something during an event, during an exercise, shoot me an email with that and just kind of caption what it is and let us know we've got permission to use that photo. Building relationships, one of the keys, and I've heard this happen in the past. Somebody walks in during an event, whatever it be, and say, "Hey, I'm the amateur radio operator in town, and I'm here to handle your comms." If that's the first time you're meeting a served agency or an MCOM person, you've waited way too late. You need to be in there way ahead of time, meeting them, talking to them, engaging them, asking them questions, and listening to them. I think one thing many of us are very type A type personalities. We like to go in and tell them what we can do for them. Many times we need to listen to what they need from us. But then we may need to coach them as well on, do you have this capability? Have you ever thought about this? Did you know we can send email over WinLink through different capabilities, either by radio or telnet or different areas? Did you know we can provide you a wireless mesh system built on old construction trailers that we have built out, which, by the way, if you're interested, there's a group up in Minnesota that has a full wireless mesh network built out over their city on the retired generator light towers. And they're set up a whole setup, and it is really a neat process, neat setup that they're doing there. Sharing successes. We need to be able to talk about things that went well, things that didn't go well, and how to build on and expound on both, okay? We need to be able to brag on ourselves. And I think sometimes as amateur radio, we're used to being in the background because that's where but we need to be able to say, hey, they asked us to do this and this. It wasn't really what we were there for, but they needed it done. So we did it, and we did it well, and they thanked us for it. It's just like what you talked about just a second ago. It didn't matter. There may be a time that you show up there to be a communications person, and all of a sudden they need somebody to help them make copies or to check a network problem or if you're that go-getter person or you're that go-getter team, guess what? They're going to remember you. They're going to call you back. They're going to be more engaged with you because you were willing to help them with what they need. Now, that doesn't mean you're not supposed to be walked on. That's a whole different story. But provide assistance as they need it. I know we talked about, Julio talking about the Haitian response. You know, there's been some that have been very good. Hurricane Ian, we know of at least one story where a ham in Massachusetts was able to pass traffic down about people being trapped on Sanibel Island, and got that. And I know that relayed through the North Florida SEC into the State Emergency Operations Center. So, you know, those are some of the good things. There were things that happened well in Puerto Rico during Maria years ago. There were some things that didn't go really well from the ham community in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that I feel like, you know, we need to talk, there again, example, we need to be able to talk and build on both, whether it's good, whether it's bad. The key is you don't make the same mistake twice. If you did mess something up, or if something didn't go particularly well, build on it, come up with an improvement plan on it, and go from there. So that's one thing for sure. By the way, on behalf of Aries and ARRL, we're going to give you another 2-year appointment. Okay? So 2 more years. Remember, the first one lasted 43. So, but the key to success is all of us. People in this group talking about what went well, what didn't go well, and how we can improve on anything we do. Because I'll be honest, I spent a number of years in fire service as well, and I never walked away from a fire scene that I didn't go, you know, we could have done this better. It may have gone great, but I always said we could have done this little part of it better. And I think that's important to go on. Do remind you all, we do have our handmade program. It's still ongoing. That has been funded 100% by either donations from manufacturers, which you mentioned earlier. I'm not an anti-Baofeng guy. I've got one, got more than one. I use them for specific purposes, but one of the things that I would encourage you is continue to purchase and do business with some of the major suppliers. They've donated to, you know, National Hurricane Center has equipment that's been donated by the major manufacturers. We've had equipment donated to our handmade program by some of the major manufacturers. Those are important. That doesn't mean you can't use the other stuff, because we all know more tools in the toolbox is a great thing. So talking about deployable, we've got a number of kits that are pre-deployed around the country. I know Louisiana has some here. There's Florida. Texas has a number of them. But anyway, they're deployed around the area. Then we have a large number also deployable from headquarters, and we can get those to you within 24 hours in most situations. If Southwest Airlines can get to your airport, we can get the go kits to you. Southwest has an agreement with us. They provide shipping for us. So we get them to Bradley Airport, and they put it on a plane and get it to you quickly. We have HT kits, which is nothing but handhelds. We have HF kits, VHF, UHF kits, and then we do have some kits that are built out with Vera capability, you know, various, depending on whether you're using Vera, whether you're using Pactor for WinLink, whatever, that we can provide. And we do have kits with the Dragon 4 modems. That's an upgrade we've made since I've been there, is we've added a few kits with the Dragon 4 modems. So if we get that, if we get the full-time symbol rate that we have legislation before Congress to get done, increase, or if we get the temporary waiver that we've been able to do. I know we got it done during Ian. So, I keep hitting the wrong one here. Recruiting. This is one of the big things that we've all as hams got to do better. Not just in Aries, but we as hams. But in Aries particular, testing sessions. Go talk to, help out at a testing session. Have something you can hand them on. Let us get you hooked up with an Aries group, and then help them. Volunteer to help them. Volunteer to say, hey, let me show you something about this. Take 30 minutes and go, let's work on this. Let's do this. Somewhere around 60% of new hams when they get involved, 50 to 60% of new hams when they get involved, when they test, MCOM is one of the reasons that they say they want to get involved, is because they want to be involved in emergency communications. Some of them realize once they get in, it's not most of the time it's not very glamorous, but if that's a reason, at least give them that opportunity to come in and try. Public safety professionals and others, you know, there's a lot going on. We're doing a lot of big push now in the schools. We're starting to see growth as amateur radio as a STEM in the STEM community in schools, and it becoming curriculum for students to learn amateur radio, and that's going to be something that we're looking at. One of the big things too that we're starting to really talk about, and it to me embodies what this hobby is at the hobby side, is innovation. You know, we've been inventing new stuff and coming up with new ways to do things since its inception. Ironically, today is a 50th anniversary in the United States. Well, not in the United States, but in the world. 50 years ago today, do you know what happened? It's technical related, very technical related. I'll give you a hint. You've all got one. 50 years ago today, ironically, was the very first cell phone contact in the U.S. And remember, when cell phones came out, what did they say? Ought to be the death of amateur radio. It'll kill amateur radio. It's going to go completely away. It's been 50 years. We've heard that about digital communications. We've heard that about satellite communications. And what have we done? We've integrated and innovated, come up with innovative ways to use the cell phone along with amateur radio. It's that time now to start doing the same thing with satellites and with satellite communications and all that kind of thing. So we've got to continue to build and to innovate and to grow our hobby. And that's one of the important things for us with Aries, and continuing to what we've done. I did shorten things up a little bit, but I am available for questions, or we'll be in the Q&A session, or I'll be around all week. So if you've got any questions, let me know. Any questions here right quick before we go? Thank you all very much, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. And like I said, 2 more years anyway.
All right, so our last speaker is Kilo Delta 5 Kilo November Zulu, Matt Anderson, Louisiana Assistant Section Manager. He's going to talk a bit about the IDA response, and then we'll be into our Q&A session. Matt?
Good morning, everybody. I want to talk a little bit about the communication side of the response over here. Usually I spend most of my time at GOSEP during these hurricanes, but this year I actually didn't get to make it in and had to do some of the remote work like we were discussing earlier. So as y'all know, and we kind of talked about it earlier during the weather part of it, the storm made landfall at Port Fourchon. For those that y'all don't know about the area, that's kind of our big oil and gas area, so a lot of activity in there as far as offshore work. One of the things we started seeing from the beginning was the wide area power outages and communication issues. Interesting article I found here was they were talking about half of the cell sites in the state went offline. FCC puts out a report. They start coming out. I didn't actually see them for a while because no internet where I was at for a few days. But you can see in the red area here, those are the areas that had the most significant communication problems. This report actually shows that by parish, if you look down here like Terrebonne Parish, 100% of their cell sites were out. And we just, well, what we're just talking about, cell phones, where, that we, maybe don't need ham radio because everybody's got a cell phone. Well, you can see at the beginning, nobody had a cell phone for a while, and it took them about 7 days to finally get the service back up and running. I think where I'm at in St. Tammany Parish, it was probably I don't know, 4 or 5 days, and some of the sporadic sites started coming on, but it was well into a week or 10 days by the time you could depend on having good coverage. The other thing that was affected here is the wireline and cable. This is your home internet connections, whether it's through internet or whatever. At one point, we had over 450,000 people out of service. And some of these actually affected our public safety communication systems. A lot of these sites are actually connected together by older T1 lines. And when they went down, the sites couldn't talk from one site to another. You still had communication within your area, but you couldn't talk to the next area over, which was a little confusing for some users. They are working on upgrading that now. The state is actually trying to get fiber out to all these sites. So once that happens, their systems are going to be a whole lot more reliable. Broadcast was another issue that we had as far as you're talking about the public gets, their information from the news media. Our AM, FM, and TV stations were all reporting outages, some even here in the New Orleans area that was quite a ways away from the impact. One of the bigger issues we had was this 2,000-foot tower about 30 or 40 miles up from here. It collapsed during the storm, and then they had to scramble to try to find replacement towers to get their coverage back out. The public safety answering points, these are your 911 centers. As you can see, the first couple of days, they were having quite a bit of problems. They had to reroute to different centers or to their non-emergency numbers. So it was probably September 4th before they were able to get back to normal operations. A little bit about the amateur radio response. I kind of went through some of the old emails and notes. Region 1, which is here in the New Orleans area, we had some of the hams helping out with some of the EOCs that suffered communication problems. They had the Florida Baptist group up here with their trailer, and I think they helped out with some WinLink and some IT issues there. In Region 2, had a lot of power issues, not so much of the physical damage there, but mostly power issues. A lot of the sites were running on generator. Region 3, this is down towards the coast there where they had more of the physical damage. You can see in the photo, one of the clubs down there lost one of their antennas on the system. We're talking about the ARL Go kits. We were able to get some of those shipped down to that area, and they were able to help out with that. Region 9, which is kind of north of here, on the other side of the lake, had a lot of activity there. They did lose a couple of repeaters, and one of the towers fell over in that area. At the state EOC, we had volunteers operating Sunday night all the way into Tuesday. The picture here is a link system that we've got right now. It's 5 repeaters. I was able to communicate with them remotely through that. One of the EOCs in Region 3, they were on there pretty much until Tuesday, every couple hours calling in a request. Amateur radio was their only method of communication. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get with them beforehand on the WinLink, and that's one of our goals now, to get them set up on WinLink where they can send these reports in electronically. Takes forever to get it by voice if you got to repeat the phone number, the street address, and everything else. We have a way now through the WinLink we can actually import our reports into WebEOC, so we don't have to retype anything. We receive it, transpose the columns, and then upload it into WebEOC, and then that way the emergency management people can help, get the people the things they've requested. As far as the state EOC, one of the things we've been working on is getting a little better organized over there. We kind of divided everything in the training up into 4 categories. Level 1 is basically going to be a new person that comes in off the street. We want them to have their FCC license. They need to be at least 18, and then we'll give them a brief orientation. And then they can work with another experienced operator at that point. Once you get to level 2, we want you to have your basic ICS courses and have a general class license. At that point, you're pretty comfortable working in the EOC by yourself, although we usually try to have a couple people there if possible. The level 3, we want to get them onto the ARL, emergency communication courses. And level 4, like we were talking about earlier, is the Oxcom and the ComL courses and things like that. And that's one of the things we're going through right now with the Oxcom is the certification process. Actually, the state is working with that, so hopefully we'll have our people credentialed in that at some point. Just as last year, we were able to get some money from the state. We've upgraded our equipment. We bought some 7300s. The last radios we had were purchased after Katrina. They were starting to have some display problems. So we were able to get some grant money, bought a couple 7300s and some 5100s. We've upgraded our WinLink station with the Pactor 4 modem, and we can operate that on shares or amateur frequencies. And we're trying to get finished up with the IT people right now and to getting all that set up online so we can be an actual gateway station. And the last thing we're working on is we're finally got funding for our repeater network that we've been planning for a couple years. I think I talked about it last time I was here, but we're looking at 10 repeater sites we're going to link together. I've been looking at the SARS system over there in Florida on how they have that set up. The only difference we're looking at here is we're probably going to be using a fiber optic system that the state owns. It runs up and down the interstate.
Is that going to be based on D1?
No, it's going to be analog only, and that was one of the considerations that somebody asked about DMR, because the repeaters support DMR. The only problem is the EOCs don't have DMR at this point, so we're going to have to go strictly analog, and it'll be an option to upgrade in the future.